Morning, Shavua Tov. For those who have the photocopies, we're on page Yutes. And as I mentioned on Yom Chamishi, we're going to be studying the Imre Moshe. Just a word about who he was. This is one of the outstanding Talmidim of Reb Chaim Britzker, and his name was Reb Moshe Sokolovsky. So I would say he died probably around, I would say 1950, 1940, somewhere in that period of time. And he's very much bothered by this essay Dochalosasa business over here. He says the following: we have a fundamental principle with regard to essay Dochalosasa. By the way, I have an extra copy here. So, and that's called Efshal L'Kayim Shneim. What that means is that if we can fulfill the mitzvah without overriding the lo taseh, we have to check out every possibility of doing so. And he asks the following question: in the context of Yibum, we could probably fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum without violating the lo taseh, even if she's an Erev. How so? First of all, there are other brothers, and she's only an Erev to Reuven. She's not an Erev to Levi. And secondly, let's assume she has a tzara, meaning that Shimon, who died, was married to two wives. One of them was an Erev to Reuven. One of them was not an Erev to Reuven. What compels us to apply the principle of, what allows us, I would say, to apply the principle of Esei Dochalosas in the case of Efshel L'Kayim Shneim? Let's read his language inside. He says, Kaimalon, she'ein Esei Dochalosas, el b'makom she'i Efshel L'Kayim Esei b'lo averetz halah. When it's a no-win situation, it's an impossible, a head-on collision, and you cannot fulfill both the essay and avoid violating the law at the same time. In order to fulfill the essay, you must override the law. So there's just no other possibility, no other scenario. Then we apply essay dochalosas. But in the event that we can have that cake and eat it, we can be mekayim the essay without violating the law. So then we don't apply the principle of essay dochalosas. Is therefore this whole parsha from which we're deriving the conclusion that Yibum applies even if his wife's sister would fall for Yibum. I mean, that was the Havamina before the special drudge of Oleha. Then it must be that there's a tzara, because we're going to derive from this parsha the halach of tzaras erva, which means that not only is his achos ishto, meaning that Reuven and Shimon were married to two sisters, not only is achos ishto of Reuven falling for Yibum, but Shimon had another wife, we'll call her Rivka, and she is not related to Reuven. So if by definition our scenario is such that we're talking about an erva with a tzaras erva, there's no erva relation to the tzaras erva, how can you override the lotus of the erva of achos ishto vis-a-vis that woman that is an erva when you have another option to fulfill the mitzvah even with the other wife who's not an erva? V'chein, yeshnom od achim. Now the Torah doesn't say that we're talking about a case where Reuben is the only brother, and as far as Yibum, he's the only act in town. Maybe there's a third brother, Levi, and a Yavamas Muteres and she, as far as Levi is concerned, is not an erva. So why are we going to allow Reuven to override the Iser erva in the case of Yibum based on Esei Dochalosas, when we don't apply Esei Dochalosas if it's Efshel L'Kayim Shneim? Here we can get the mitzvah done and L'Hakim Shem Liachim Ames without overriding the Losas, without overriding the Iser erva, either if there's another brother or if there's another wife. And in fact, we know there's another wife because this is the very parsha of Tzaras erva. Wow. In Kane, just summarizing the question, he says, Eich ola al das ha-gemara, she'ilule oleh, if not for the drasha of oleh, tutar, we can be matir, the erva to the yavam. Halo yechol l'skayma mitzvah, I would sort of rewrite it a little bit. I think it's really halo yechol ha-mitzvah l'skayim bi'ach acher o bi'yavama ha-muteres. How could we have a havamina here before the pasuk that essay dochalosas should apply in this case? We could fulfill the essay with a different brother or with a different wife, and therefore there's no erva. V'tires. Now, I read this already, but sometimes I read something and I forget what I read. So I'm going to give you my own answer, but I'm not trying to plagiarize. And 99% it's going to be his answer. But just in case, it's my answer. There are two dimensions to evil. I call them Gavra and Chefta, sort of. Meaning there's the Lahakim Shem Zerli Achiv, and then there's the Chiyuv on one individual to fulfill that mitzvah of evil. So what are you going to tell me? You're going to tell me that he has another brother. He's got Levi. Let Levi fulfill the mitzvah of evil. That's not Efshar L'Kayim. Reuven wants to get this mitzvah. As far as Reuven is concerned, he has to override this evil. Now let's switch to the other side of the tennis court. Let's talk about the ladies over here, the wives of Shimon who died. Yeah, you're right. The mitzvah of Yibum could be fulfilled through the other wife, not through Leah, but through Rivka. But what about Leah? Leah wants to have the opportunity of fulfilling that mitzvah of Yibum, and vis-a-vis her, there's no possibility of Yibum. If I'm saying, in other words, if we emphasize the Gavra and the mitzvah that's incumbent upon the individual, or let's say Reuven wants to get the mitzvah, and let's call her Leah wants to get the mitzvah. What do you mean there are other ways of fulfilling the mitzvah? Those other ways entail other people, which would not give the opportunity to those to fulfill the mitzvah. That's not Efshar L'Kayim Shnei. Efshar L'Kayim Shnei means I can find another way of fulfilling the mitzvah of Milah without overriding, let's say, Tzitzas B'Eretz, let's say the lav of, okay, so then you don't apply Esei Dochalosis. But you have to address yourself to the person who has both an Esei and a Los Esei. If as far as that person is concerned, there's no other opportunity, then it's the Efshar L'Kayim Shnei. Let's see if that's what he said. Again, I don't remember what he says. B'tirates, sheyesh lahamid es hapasuk b'makom she'ein ha'acher v'yavam acheres lefadmeinu. So maybe what I just told you is going to be another interpretation. But the Imrei Moshe is saying that where is Levi? Levi's not to be found. Maybe he took a long boat to, I hate to say the word, to China, or maybe she, the Tzara, I don't know, she's out there in Oshkosh, so we don't have access to them. So the pasuk should apply in all cases, even in a case where there's no other brother available or there's no other Yevama available. And therefore, Efshar L'Kayim Mitzvah, Ela b'Yavam v'Yavama Elu. We only have in front of us this Yavam and this Yavama, and the Torah addresses the mitzvah of Yibum in this case, and it's the Efshar L'Kayim Shneihem. Ach, Chasav, Adover Shonui b'Machlokas Rishonim b'Makom Shav Mitzvah Mitzad Atzma Yechol L'Kayim Lo Averes Allah El She'ira b'Mikra She'ein a mitzvah yechol is kaim below adchia im nechshav gam biofen zeli efshar L'Kayim Shneihem olo. He tells us as a machlokas rishonim, which in the footnote he tells us a machlokas the Ramban and the Rashba, which is on Daf Dalet on Beis, and we'll have to wait to see the Ramban and the Rashba when we get to Daf Dalet. But they're going to argue about the following. We should underline a few words here. Let's underline the word mitzvah atzma. And let's underline the words ira b'mikra. Do you see those words? Oh. And here's going to be the machlokas. How do we apply and when do we apply esei dochalosis? According to one approach, it all depends on ira b'mikra. And that means it all depends upon the reality in front of us now. That's ira b'mikra. Mikra meaning coincidentally. As far as we're concerned, we look at the coincidence of facts and in the scenario as it is in front of us. According to the other approach, no. We go back to the mitzvah atzma. We define the mitzvah. If the mitzvah in its abstract definition can only be fulfilled by overriding the los haseh, then we apply Esei Dochalosasa because it's the Yevshel Kaim Shneim. But what exists in front of you in the reality, who's here and who's not, that's coincidental, that's irrelevant. Whereas the other opinion, the other approach is that whether it's Efshel Kaim Shneim or not depends upon the reality in front of us. Therefore, says the Rei Moshe, we're going to have to assume reality, meaning it depends upon Ira b'mikra. If Ira b'mikra, that the other Yavam, called Lev, the other brother, is out in Ashkash, or the other Yavam, called her the Tzara, is out wherever she's out, then that's called Ira b'mikra, and there's no way of fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum as is with the facts on the ground, unless we override the lotus. That's called Esei Dochalosa. The other approach would say, wait a minute. It happens to be coincidentally that the other Yavam is out there and the Tzara is out there, but that's irrelevant. The mitzvah per se is not incumbent upon him and her in a way that it's impossible, the only way of, let's look at the mitzvah in abstract terms. And in abstract terms, this mitzvah does not necessarily require overriding a lota. Said there may be other brothers, and she's not an erev on the other brothers, or there may be other Yevamos, right? There's a Tzoras erev. So the Rei Moshe in sum realizes that we're going to have to go down one particular path here in order to resolve his problem. In a sense, he leaves the problem unresolved if you hold that it depends upon the abstract mitzvah. Because, okay, fine, the other Yavam is not around, the other Yavam is not around, but so what? The mitzvah atzma, as we emphasized it, is Yechol Iskayim Afilu B'Liyah Veres Allah. That mitzvah itself could be fulfilled. However, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who he was killed by the Nazis during the war, so he writes in Kovetz HaOros that there's another way of approaching this kasha of the Imrei Moshe. By the way, he and Rav Moshe Sokolovsky were more or less contemporaries. They lived at the same time. I don't know the history. I think the Imrei Moshe may have died before the war. Rabbi Chanan died during the war. Yesh Lachka. He says the following. How do we look at Esei Dochalosas and define the essay? There are two ways of defining the essay. One way is defining the essay by analyzing the mitzvah and its goal, its purpose. I would call that the kiyum mitzvah. What's the ultimate goal of the mitzvah? Every mitzvah has some goal. There's another way of defining essay, and that he calls the gavra, the responsibility and the obligation that's incumbent upon so-and-so. And that person is compelled to want to fulfill his mitzvah. In the language of Elchanan, he says, Yesh lachar b'yisod din esei dochalosas. Ha'im adchia hi hidei shetiskayem ha-mitzvah. That means the agenda of the mitzvah will be fulfilled. Kigon b'yibu. She'iskayem shem li'achiv. The ultimate, shall we say, goal of the mitzvah, the agenda of the mitzvah, the achievement is that we have a child that will continue the name of the deceased brother. Oh, the second possibility in this Hakira is that the application of Esei Dochalosa as a din b'gavra depends on the person, that for the purpose of getting this person the achievement of the mitzvah, his brownie points up in Shamayim, if it's necessary, in order for him to achieve his mitzvah, he has to violate a lav, we will apply the principle of Esei Dochalosas. It doesn't depend upon the agenda of the mitzvah, which means that tiskayim a mitzvah. It depends upon the gavra being mekayim his mitzvah. If we take the second approach, this yashiv akusha now, we now have an answer to the Imrei Moshe's question. And not only that, we don't have to introduce the machlokas between the Ramban and the Rashba, as we'll soon see. Mishum, if you're looking at the tiskayim mitzvah, at the achievement of the goal of the mitzvah, then you're right. It's Yechol Iskayim al Yidei Achiv. He has another brother who's not, there's no erva, or there's another Yevamot is a tzara. He says, no, we're not going to take that approach and therefore call it Efshel L'Kayim Shneim, right? We could have our cake and eat it because it depends on the mitzvah atzma, but rather it depends and it reflects the mitzvah sagav. He mitzvah sagav shal yavam atzmo, as far as he's concerned, he has no possibility of fulfilling his obligation, his personal chiyuv. Edom is kayemis ella al yidei atzmo. It's very nice if his other brother will fulfill the mitzvah, but that doesn't give him the mitzvah. And therefore, as far as he is concerned, since she is an erva, therefore it's ef shel kaim shnei, and we can apply esido chalosas. Again, but we haven't yet addressed her, and he's only solved 50% of the problem because she may have a tzara. Od hosif. You may recall that on the previous page, which we discussed last week, on page Yud Ches here, we had Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Kiva came to the conclusion that the Yevama also has a mitzvah of Yibum. She too is given the obligation of the mitzvah of Yibum, because otherwise we have a problem. If she's not obligated, why would she be allowed to violate the Isser Erva for his mitzvah? Unless you take the radical chiddush here of the Tosfos Yom HaKippurim, which Rabbi Kiva said you can't accept according to one day of Tosfos in the sugya of Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chor. But we're not going to go over that whole thing right now. But the bottom line is Rabbi Kiva comes to the conclusion that according to Tosfos, we have to assume that not only is he, the Yavam, obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum, but she likewise is obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. Otherwise, it's impossible and unthinkable to apply essay dochalos. If she doesn't have the essay, how could she participate in this Maisa of Erva? If we assume so, then we have a beautiful answer to the kasha of the Moshe. Because now, what are you going to tell me? That you could be Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum through Hatzara, but she has her own personal obligation vis-a-vis the mitzvah of Yibum. And therefore, that's not considered Eino ki efshar l'kayim shneim, sharei l'tzorch kiyum mitzvah sa. I mean, here you have to have a mapik hey, yesh l'lav lidcham. You can do docha the lav for the sake of her mitzvah. However, that's only reconcilable according to Rabbi Kiva. The essay shall he says the following. So this works out according to Rabbi Kiva, who says that she has an obligation of Yibum. But now he enters into the issue of the Tosfos Yom HaKippurim. The Tosfos Yom HaKippurim, if you may recall, says that one person who has the essay could allow for the principle of essay docha losasa to operate even on behalf of someone else who has to partner up with him for fulfillment of the essay, even if that other partner is not obligated in the mitzvah. El she'ein ze el shitos she'essay shel echad matir af lav shel chavera. He says that everything fits into place if you accept the radical breakthrough of the Tosfos Yom HaKippurim, that one person's essay can be matir the lav on behalf of his friend, even though his friend is not obligated in that essay. Shem located eich mutar liyav liyama im hu yachol l'kayim mitzvah b'tzarasa halo mitzido yachol hu l'kayim shnei. This is again a checkmate. Says Rabbi Chanan, you're talking about the Chovas Gavra, and you're saying that essay dochalosa applies to the Gavra, and you're saying that as far as he's concerned, he has, he can pass the buck over to his brother, who's not in the problematic situation of an erva, but that would forfeit his own mitzvah. But he says, wait a second, why can't he fulfill the mitzvah with the Sarah? Even as far as the Chovas Gavra is concerned, he cannot fulfill, he has the option of fulfilling the mitzvah even without violating the law of erva by being the Sarah. See, then you're going to answer me, but what about the Yevama, meaning the Achos Ishto, the Erva herself? If we assume, like Rabbi Kivega, that she has an obligation of Yibum, then you're forfeiting her mitzvah for the sake of the Tzara. So let's apply Esei Dochalosa says so that the Gav of the Yevama, in this case the Erva, could fulfill her mitzvah. Yeah, but the problem is, he's not obligated in that mitzvah. In other words, as far as he's concerned, it's Efshel Kaim Shtei because he has another option. He could just as well be Miyabim. We called her Rivka, the Tzara, and she's not an Erva. Okay, it would mean that Leah, the Erva, would have to forfeit her mitzvah. But so what? We want to know whether it's Efshel Kaim Shtei as far as he's concerned. Does he have to violate the law and have a relationship with the Erva? He doesn't. He has the option of the Tzara. So Rebbe Chanan says that the only way out of that problem, otherwise you're in a checkmate situation, is to assume that one person's mitzvah could be matir alav for somebody else who's not obligated in that mitzvah, which was the radical revolution of the Tosefes Yom Kippur. So therefore, he can override his love of erva by having a yibum with the erva, because she has no option of being Mekayim her mitzvah of erva. Of her mitzvah of yibum without violating the of erva. So this, I don't know if you want to call it to transpose or transmute, whatever the right English word is, I don't know. But we're going to transmute her ef shalakayim shneir onto him, allowing him to apply esei dochalosas. And for the sake of her, because in her world, it's impossible for her to have the essay and fulfill that essay of even without violating the Yisur Erf. And that's enough to shift it over to him and say that we'll apply essay dochalosas to him. So basically, according to Rabbi Chana, we have to postulate and assume two premises. Number one, we have to assume that she has a mitzvah yimu, because otherwise, how is she going to override the losas if she doesn't have the essay? So we're going to have to assume, number two, that you can shift the chiyuv of essay, the application of essay dochalosas from one person to the other. And if there's essay dochalosas for one person, and there's a partnership in the violation of the law of another person, that other person is not chayav in the essay, we can shift over the essay from one person. So what we did now in the last 25 minutes, if I was giving a shir to 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds, as I did for many, many years of my life, it would probably take me an hour. But because you gentlemen are so brilliant, such geniuses, I can do it in 25 minutes. But really, this is so profound. I mean, if you notice a lot of what we've been doing until now, it came to the fore, in this Imre motion. Now, I don't know who the Kisa the Harsana is. I can only tell you that he's quoted quite frequently by Rebbe Chanan. And in this case, he has an unbelievable kasha, which is quoted by Rebbe Chanan in the Kovetz Ha'aretz, the Kisa the Harsana, which is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a name that's borrowed from a sugya in Masechet Brachos. All right. I'm going to try to give a little bit of an introduction to this kasha. I read it over many times. And what I love about this kasha, it's not only profound, but it's like out of the box. It's sometimes we're so used to rigid logic in halacha that we don't think out of the box. And that's what I think he's doing over here, this Kisa Daharsi. If I were to put the following on a scale, A and B, and try to see which way is heavier. On one side of the scale, I put an essay, call it Nibum in our case. On the other side of the scale, and again, just think out of the box, we have Pikuach Nefesh, a situation in which we need to do X in order to save life. And if you'd weigh these two things on a scale, where would you place an essay vis-a-vis pikuach nefesh? Which is heavier on your scale? Absolutely, pikuach nefesh. Because pikuach nefesh is docha, overrides all the mitzvahs in the Torah, with the exception of 3 cardinal sins. But as a general rule, for sure, for the sake of pikuach nefesh, we will. Now, in our sugya of Yibum, we're applying essay docha losaseh for the essay of Yibum to override the losaseh of an Erev. Now, where does Arayas fit in to the general rule of pikuach nefesh? Can a man say they got a gun to his head, have relations with an erva, and if you don't, we'll knock your block off? Is he allowed to apply the principle of pikuach nefesh? What's the answer? No, there's no pikuach nefesh, because this is one of the 3 exceptions. So now, if you've already agreed to me that on the scale of things, pikuach nefesh is heavier than a mitzvah, and yet in the case of pikuach nefesh, we cannot override an erva like achos ishto, how could it be possible that essay docha losa said that an essay that's lower on the echelon could override the losas of an erva, which overrides pikuach nefesh, if you follow me? In other words, pikuach nefesh, which is so overpowering, so overwhelming, it's like, amatzil nefesh achas Yisrael is keilu hitzos kol olam kulo, and it overrides every essay, and yet it cannot override erva. You will not allow a violation of harayas, of gilui harayas, even for the sake of saving human life. And now you're going to tell me that an essay is docha harayos? Now I say again, this is thinking out of the box, because those of us, trained in a certain rigorous system, it would never cross our minds to start comparing essay docha losa with pikuach nefesh. Like, if I raise my hand to Rav Salvation class in a shir about essay docha losa, he said, Rebbe, what about pikuach nefesh? He would throw me out of shir. Like, who's learning pikuach nefesh? So let's see it inside. Kasha, eich sal kedaita, on the second line. She'essay docha af losa shel harayos sheyesh bo kores. Later on, the Gemara is going to reject this havamina, because the source for essay docha losa is going to be kalayim v'tzitzis, and kalayim or shatnis is not a chi of kores. But right now, the Gemara is of the opinion, if not for the extra pasuk, we would have derived the conclusion that Yibum would override an erva, even if yesh ba kores. How could that be? It says, hello, Kaimalon. We have a principle with regard to an erva, a yesh ba kores, right? Yehareg val yavar. We will not override the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh or dvarim kal v'chomer. If you're going to tell me, okay, so he formulates a little differently than the way I do. He says, if you're going to assume in our sugya that a mitzvah like Yibum is docha l'isur erva, is then that mitzvah now should be placed higher than, in other words, for the sake of pikuach nefesh, we should certainly assume that it's higher than the avera of gilui harayos. If a mitzvah is docha l'isur erva, then pikuach nefesh, which is even greater than an essay, because it overrides all the essay. Pikuach nefesh docha kol mitzvahs asay kol shkein sheyesh lo lidchos iser zeh. Why are you telling me yehar gal yavam? I'm going to come to the opposite conclusion, that you will violate gilui harayos for the sake of pikuach nefesh, because if you're allowed to violate gilui harayos for the sake of a mitzvah, then kol shkein you can violate gilui harayos for the sake of pikuach nefesh, because pikuach nefesh is heavier and more weighty on the scale than essay, because nefesh overrides all essay. Could you imagine, Rabosai, in a case where, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, he'd have to put his life into danger? I mean, I don't know exactly right now. My brain is not coming up with the scenario. If you could, the Yevamot, is on the other side of the ocean, and the only way you can get across the ocean is by swimming across the ocean. or taking a balloon across the ocean. It's very, very dangerous. So are you going to tell me that for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum, we should override Pikuach Nefesh? And again, I'm not trying to downgrade the mitzvah of Yibum. It's a very important mitzvah. And we got a whole Masechet about it. Must be important. But nevertheless, it would not override Pikuach Nefesh. So clearly, Pikuach Nefesh is greater than the mitzvah Saseh of Yibum. And yet, the Gemara is holding now, based on Essay Dochalosa, that the essay of Yibum will override Gili Arais. How much more so should Pikuach Nefesh override Gili Arais? And therefore, the whole Yehard Val Yavar entity is out the window. I mean, there are many people on the side who'll be applauding to that, to be very happy. I don't have to give up my life. Wow. Now, I'm like stumped. I wouldn't even begin to know how do you answer such a question. But let's think about it anyway. Is it possible to say? See, I'll tell you what bothers me about this kasha. If Rebbe Chanan says what I say, then I'm not trying to cheat or plagiarize. I think we need more of a collision, a head-on collision. And that's also what we discussed earlier in the Imrei Moshe. It's Ef Shel Kaim Shnei, but leaving out Ef Shel Kaim Shnei, there's a conflict between the essay and the losas. Pikuach Nefesh is more of like a general. It's a general principle that applies. There's a mitzvah of saving lives. Whether or not that conflicts with an essay or a losas said doesn't conflict with an essay. Yeah, you can talk about, how far do you have to go to save a life, right? The Hatzalah people, right? Let's say. I'm not talking about overriding the Shabbos for the sake of Hatzalah or any of that. Does a Hatzalah person have to fly halfway across the world for the sake of the mitzvah Hatzalah? You could ask those kind of questions. They'd be very relevant. I don't even know if there are tshuvas about it. Pikuach Nefesh and its power and its authority, its punch, if you will, is not related to collision over here. That's not to do with collision. There's a mitzvah Pikuach Nefesh. You've got to do the maximum. You know how to swim, jump into the ocean. If there's an undercurrent, don't jump into the ocean. Because you could be Mark Spitz, what's his name? Spitz, it wouldn't help you if there's an undercurrent. But assuming there's no undercurrent, jump into the water and save somebody. That has nothing to do with a head-on collision. So when we say that Pikuach Nefesh is greater than an essay, intuitively, it rubs me a little bit the wrong way. That's not really what we're saying. We're saying that Pikuach Nefesh is a great mitzvah, and it should always apply, unless you get stuck with a cardinal sin. Therefore, so the halacha of Gili Arayis tells you until what point do you apply Pikuach Nefesh. There's Gili Arayis, then there's no Pikuach Nefesh. We want to save lives, but we're not going to do it at the expense of Gili Arayis. We might have said we want to save lives, but not at the expense of flying halfway across the world. That far you don't have to go. You're not obligated. These are different measurements of the mitzvah Pikuach Nefesh. How far does it go? Like, for example, do you know my friend Dr. Howie Fell? So his spets is he does surgery not only after the baby is born, but even while the baby is in an embryonic state. So if you take a look up there, you'll see a set of books called Halach in Contemporary Society from the RJJ School. So Dr. Fell, who's a big Talmud Chacham, has an article about whether or not we save the fetus by doing this surgery according to Halach, because it always involves an element of danger to the mother, to the pregnant mother. Anyway, so these are all, analyses, if you will, of the extent and the scope of the mitzvah of Pikuach Nefesh. And Gili Arayis Now you're talking about a head-on collision between the essay of Yibum and the mitzvah and the losas of Gili Arayis, and we don't have any reason to assume otherwise. Essay docha losas, and essay is greater than a losas. Again, later on we'll discuss why. I mean, what's the philosophy here that essay is greater than a losas? But assuming it is, like some say, a losas is only shevi altas, that essay is kuvasei. It reflects the honor that we have for the Almighty, whatever it is. But essay docha losas. So you now have a collision. The only way you can fulfill this essay is by overriding the losas, and we have a power in the essay called essay docha losas. Does that mean, therefore, that pikuach nefesh would override Gili Arayis? Maybe yes, maybe no. That depends on a different discussion. What are the extent and what is the power, the scope of pikuach nefesh? Let's see if again, I'm not saying anything that's precise. I'm just giving you what I think it should be maybe the general approach to answer the question of Rabbi Chon. Kosav HaKovetzoros Liyashe Shepikuach Nefesh Eino B'Toras Dechir Elo HaIser Omeid B'Mkomo Yakshu Nechshav Ka'onus Lavor O. What's he saying? That pikuach nefesh doesn't mean that we're overriding a lo taseh, but rather he's in a state of onus. So pikuach nefesh generates onus. Right, that would apply also to misrapim. Let's say, for example, a person is deathly ill, and in order to obtain a refuah, let's say a serum that is therapeutic, he would have to violate avodah zarah. The Gemara has actually a case like that. So that would come under pikuach nefesh. Now, what we're saying is, says Rabbi Chanan, is not that pikuach nefesh overrides isurim, but rather he's got to save his life. That makes him onus. In other words, the circumstances imposed upon him a situation in which it's impossible for him to continue to live unless he violates a law. He's not violating the law out of volition, but out of compulsion. And that's called onus. So whatever I said is nothing to do with Rav Kiva. He's going on a whole different approach. He's saying that the way pikuach nefesh operates in terms of overriding a lotus is through the channel, through the halachic legal principle of onus. This avera is not considered your avera. Why? Because you had no choice in the matter. You were simply involved in saving your life. Now, at some point, the Torah could say, you know what? There are bounds to onus. We understand how desperate you are to save your life, but you can't go beyond a certain red line. And that red line are the three cardinal sins. Let's take Gili Arayis. You're an onus. Correct. This was no decision on your part. You weren't happy about having to save your life through a violation of Gili Arayis. When let's say he threatens you or something. So therefore, you're going to claim and you're going to wave the flag of onus. This is a mitigating circumstance. I had no volition, I had no decision. No, the Torah says you have a decision. You have to decide to give up your life. And we're not going to allow you to hide behind and protect yourself behind the guise of onus. There is no onus when it comes to people. I'm sorry, when it comes to Gili Arayis. But Iser Omer B'Mkomo Rak Chu Nechshav Ka'onus Lavra Lav Yomer Torah Shebe Iser Arayos Hu Mechuyev LeHareg V'Lo Lavra, which I think he means that we suspend the principle of onus. You're not considered an onus when you decide, in order at a desperation to save your own skin, that you are going to violate the Isur of Gilead rights. No, that's not onus. But here we have a much more powerful and extensive din. Why? We're not applying the principle of onus, but rather nitar ha-isur machmas ha-mitzvah. We're going to say that the isur is mutter. That on right in pikuach nefesh, the isur is always awesome. But you know what? You're violating the isur ba'onus. We'll let you off. Here in Esei Dochalosa, we're not saying that because you're onus, we're not going to find you liable and culpable for the violation of the law. No. Esei Dochalosa means in these circumstances, you have an Esei, you don't have a losas. V'eno over all of klal, you're not violating the law. Al-Kain. Well, let's see. Okay, so now we have a conception. Now let's flesh it out. Al-Kain, Salkadaita, She'af Isur Erva Nitar Bifnei HaEsei. So again, the essay has the power to be matir the lav because of essay dochalosa. It means that there's no lotas because of the essay, and you don't violate the lotas. But that has nothing to do with pikuach nefesh. Even though pikuach nefesh might find you an onus, and in the case of Yibum or any other mitzvahs, say, barring the big three, you're an onus. But you're not considered an onus with regard to Gilead Rayos. But Esei Dochalosis goes a step further than that. Because there the Torah is saying that for this, because of this essay, we don't consider the losas. So we're going to be matir the Isur Erev. So let's just go over again the kasha of the Kisei Daharson and see how Rebbe Chanan answers. We say that if Pikuach Nefesh could override an essay, and an essay could override an Erev Sheish Bakaris, how much more so should Pikuach Nefesh override a Gilead Rayos situation? If an essay like Yibum could override Gilead Rayos, then how much more so Pikuach Nefesh, which is higher on the totem pole than essay, because it overrides all the essays, certainly should be able to be Doche Gilead Rayos. Says Rabbi Chanan, no. You're making a mistake. You are applying the principle of dechia to pikuach nefesh. That's a no-brainer. That's a non-starter. You cannot take the halacha pikuach nefesh and place it into the framework of dechia. It's not about dechia. It's not the Torah saying, you know what, we'll be back to these soon. No. That's not what the Torah is saying. The Torah is saying that when you involve yourself in saving your life or someone else's life, any violation that you violate, we're gonna be lenient, we're gonna be compassionate, and we're gonna classify it as onus. Up to a certain point. You know, for the sake of saving your life, can you kill somebody? The answer is that's the limit of onus. What do you mean? Why are you telling me I can't kill him? I'm only killing him because I'm desperate to save my own life. No. That doesn't cut the, that doesn't cut the ice. You can't say, well, I'm going to murder somebody because my life is in danger. That's not onus. And the Torah is now considering Gilead Rayos like murder. That's how severe it is. The onus is not going to allow you to violate Gilead Rayos. You made that decision that for the sake of your life, you're going to violate Gilead Rayos. The Torah says, no. Ad kan. You're crossing all the red lines. This is not within the purview of onus. Came here, and now a sugya of Yibum overriding an Erev, and that's a din of Dechia, in which the Torah says that when you have this flip the coin here, you have a choice of either putting the essay on top and ignoring the losas, or ignoring the essay for the sake of observing and preserving the losas. And the Torah says the essay is more important than the losas. We don't know why, but that's what it is. So the essay now suspends the losas. It neutralizes the law. He's not violating the Isur Gilead Rayos. Now I'm wondering, according to Rabbi Chanan, please tell me I'm wrong about this. According to Rabbi Chanan, if I violate the Torah for the sake of pikuach nefesh, I would have to do tshuva for it, no? Like for example, There's a famous machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid, that if the physician tells you because of your situation you have to eat nevela, you make a bracha on the nevela. If I'm not mistaken, it's at the end of Hilchos Brachas. The Rambam holds yes, and the Ravid says no. According to this Rebbe Chana, when I have to eat the nevela to save my life, I should not be making a bracha. The Ravid is right. How can you make a bracha when you're violating the Isur of nevela? Again, the Torah says you're an onus, but you're still eating nevela. And the Rambam says no, this is not onus. Maybe Rebbe Chana would say that since it's called onus, therefore, according to the Rambam, once you're in a situation of onus, then you can make a bracha. Yeah, that could be possible. Okay. Achadayim kosh. After this whole gigantic PhD thesis of the Kovetz Aris, he says, it's not smooth. I still have to raise an objection. What about pikuach nefesh? Pikuach nefesh doesn't only mean I'm desperate and I have to save my life. Pikuach nefesh is a mitzvah. It comes under a mitzvah. The Torah says, "V'shmartem miyodas nafshel sechem," or "v'chayban." V'logara esei zeh mishar esei. So that even though you'll tell me that the Torah is pikuach nefesh, I cannot allow him to be mandala erva because there's no status of ones vis-a-vis Gilui Arayos. But why not apply esei dochalosa? So every case of pikuach nefesh, by definition, entails an esei. One of the 613 is to save lives. In fact, I would say it's not only an essay, it's also an essay and a losa. It's a lotamet al dam riach if you could save someone's life. Ulafia havamina essay dochalosa, even in the case of a lav shel erva. All right, let's see if we can come up with an answer to this question. And he's asking why not apply essay dochalosa to the case of pikuach nefesh. I would say that lamaskana that we don't apply essay dochalosa to a losa sheish bo kares. That's why you have to give up your life in order to avoid Gilui Arayos, even for the sake of the great mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, because we can't apply it. But according to the happening, that essay dochalosa should apply, as it does in the case of yibum with an erva. For the sake of saving my life, we should override the lotase of Gilui Arayos. Again, it really cash. Yeah, what do you say?
I mean, inherent in good nefesh isn't a limitation. And it's only the essay if it's not.
I mean, just like we're saying, there's no onus, there's no mitzvah.
Right.
In that situation, you're in a situation where the only way you can fulfill this mitzvah is by violating Gilui Arayos. The Torah says there is no essay. How do we know that? Because the Torah equates it with Ritzicha. Gilui Arayos is like Ritzicha. I mean, Ritzicha, even if you'd have to save someone, but you would kill someone else in order to save him, you're not allowed to save him. And the reason for that is because in such a case, there is no essay. We're not just saying that in such a case, we won't call you an onus. We won't grant you that, legal protection, like the what do they call it, the witness protection program. We're not going to allow you to be protected because you're an onus. We're saying even more than that there is no essay of pikuach nefesh. That's pretty good. I like it. Let's see. Oh, he says the Chinam. Nemar. Say, oh wow, ooh, he's going out on a limb here. This is very atypical. He's saying, according to this Havamina, Enochinami, you would override Gili Arayis for the sake of the mitzvah of Pikuach Nefesh. And we would therefore suspend the halacha of Yehargal Yav as far as Arayis is concerned. But if we had a case where Pikuach Nefesh was not a mitzvah saseh, then we could apply the principle of Yehargal Yav. Matzina l'din Pikuach Nefesh af below mitzvah hatzolah. So let's say we have a case of Pikuach Nefesh without, it's stripped, it's minus the mitzvah of Hatzolah, and if you're only dealing with Pikuach Nefesh as an ones, and in such a case, we would apply Yehard Val Yava because ones doesn't apply to Gili Arayis. Keep going, where do you have a case of Pikuach Nefesh without a mitzvah of Hatzolah, don't be'ubar, af sheyesh bo din Pikuach Nefesh, we come go eno, the mitzvahs asay shal atzolas nefashos. Wow. This, I think, is based on Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim learned by Reb Chaim, I think, for 2 years. I think Reb Chaim, I'd have to look it up for you, is of the opinion that an ubar is a very unique status in Allah. The ubar is not called a nefesh as far as mitzvah. That's why we would kill the ubar to save the mother. Remember this? The Mishnah Olas. So we kill the ubar to save the mother. Because the ubar is not a nefesh. Let's say on Yom Kippur, a pregnant woman has, the ubar, so to speak, whispers in her ear that I have to eat something. In other words, for the sake of saving the ubar, she has to eat. Then we will override Yom Kippur, even though it's a nefesh. That's not really a nefesh, but it's enough of a nefesh to be dochi surah. But not enough of a nefesh, apparently, according to Rabbi Chanan, I don't know if to be considered a mitzvah of hatzolah. Hatzolah means to save a nefesh, meaning a nefesh gom. But before birth, it's not considered a nefesh, and there is no mitzvah of hatzolah. So let's say that for the sake of saving an ubar, you'd have to violate, let's say, lo sirtza. You'd have to kill someone. So then we would have to say the following, that even though, as far as the laws of pikuach nefesh is concerned, there is a pikuach nefesh in the nefesh of an ubar, and therefore the ubar has that status of pikuach nefesh. So we will override all the mitzvahs for the sake of pikuach nefesh because that would be considered ones, and even for an ubar, it's considered ones, but minus the mitzvahs aseh. And therefore, if what? If the losas, right? So there's no essay of pikuach nefesh. So if there's no essay, you back to the halacha of pikuach nefesh, and there's no onus in these cases of Yehar Kal Yav. Well, again, let's just see how this works out. In the case of Yibum, we're going to say essay docha losas because we definitely have an essay in front of us. And the essay has the power to override a losas, so we're holding out, even if it's a chiv karis like an erv. Pikuach nefesh does not override Gili Arayis, and we say a hargal yafor. That's because we're dealing with pikuach nefesh without a mitzvah saseh, minus a mitzvah saseh. Just 1 second. Instead, we apply a hargal yafor. Yeah, this would be interesting. let's talk about a katan. Let's say a 9-year-old boy, and he's the Yavam, and his older brother Shimon died, and now there's an error that falls for Yibam to this katan. So he doesn't have a mitzvah Yibam, right? He's a katan. Right, so that's not going to help me here. Again, we apply essay dochal when there's a mitzvah saseh. So in the case of a katan, there'd be no hava, meaning that he'd be miyabe an error. Because then there's no essay to be dochal the losas right. However, where there is an essay, we would be dochal losas. So now, why don't we, instead of Yehorig Val Yav, we say Yav Val Yevar? So the answer is because there's no mitzvah essay. How can you have a case of Yehorig Val Yav when there's no mitzvah essay? I mean, after all, Pikuach Nefesh is a mitzvah essay to save a life. And the answer is in the case of an Uber. Couldn't you have quoted a case of a katan? Pikuach Nefesh, there's no onus. First mitzvah, there's no mitzvah. It's an interesting question. No, this is an interesting question. Would a katan be allowed to murder someone to save his life? He doesn't have an Isur B'tzicha. So we said that Pikuach Nefesh doesn't go that far to give you a status of an onus vis-a-vis these Averas Kamuris, but he doesn't have those Averas. So for the sake of saving his own life, B'toras Pikuach Nefesh, he should be allowed to murder someone. And I'm just thinking of. So just to summarize, so what do we get from this Rebbe Chan? An answer to the question of the Kisa Daharsin. What the Kisa Daharsin is saying, how do you justify a Yehorig Val Yav if essay docha losas, even a losas sheish bokaris like Gilia writes? And yet Pikuach Nefesh doesn't help you because Yehorig Val Yav. And the answer is Pikuach Nefesh can't help you because this is the outer boundary of onus. You don't go beyond the boundaries into the world of Gilia rights. But in a case of essay dochalosas, like Yibum with an erva, there the Torah says the essay overrides the losa set, and the losa set doesn't generate an isur at all. Now Rabbi Chanan asks, but wait a minute, what about Pikuach Nefesh as a mitzvah saseh? Why can't that be docha the lav of Gilia rights? And the answer is Einochinam. According to the Havamina of the Gemara now, that Esi Dochel also applies to the Lav Sheish Bokares, there would be no Yehorig Val Yav. So then the question becomes, so when is the Yehorig Val Yav? And the answer is, in a case of Pikuach Nefesh minus an Aseh. How could you even begin to orchestrate, right, to engineer a case where it's Pikuach Nefesh without an Aseh to save a life? And the answer is Uber. That there are two dinim in Uber. On the one hand, the Ubar, for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh, will generate this halach of onus. So for the sake of saving the Ubar, we can violate whatever we have to violate. But there's no essay of Pikuach Nefesh in the case of an Ubar, where the Ubar is a Nefesh Einu Gomer. It's not a complete Nefesh, and there's no mitzvah of Hats. So 1 second, let me just ask you a different question. Let's say a gadol is running after a katan to kill him. Do we kill the gadol? We say that we have to kill the gadol to save the katan. Okay, that's fine. But if a gadol would be running after an ubar, like let's say, again, this doesn't sound so nice, but let's say there's a physician who wants to implement an abortion and destroy the life of an Uber. The Uber is otherwise a viable being, and we have no reason. But in our modern permissive society, she says she's hiring a physician to do this operation and destroy the life of the Uber. Can we kill the physician? Midin Rodev. But the answer is a Rodev, you kill the Rodev to save the life of the Nirdav. But in this case, it's only an Uber. And just 1 second. So in the case of the Uber, so what are we saying for the sake of Hatzola and Pikuach Nefesh? But the Uber we said is included on the Pikuach Nefesh. So you should be allowed to save the Uber. But 1 second, there's no mitzvah. Here's the question. What happens if you have Pikuach Nefesh without a mitzvah of Hatzol in the case of an Uber? Is that Pikuach Nefesh minus the mitzvah Pikuach Nefesh enough to justify killing the Rodev? You think not? I think yes, but I don't know. It's a toss-up. I don't have a proof one way or the other. Intuitively, I sense that as long as there's Pikuach Nefesh, right, we're going to feed this pregnant woman on Yom Kippur to save the Uber, so then Pikuach Nefesh will allow me to do whatever I have to do to save this Nefesh. Now we're saying there's a limit to onus in the case of Tzitcha, and then it's Yehardal Yavor, and you can't apply Esito Philosophy. So, you're right. Yeah, I made a mistake. Yeah, he's right, 100%. Because the limitations of Pikuach Nefesh is with Tzitcha. Unless, maybe in the case of a Rodev, there's no Ritzicha. That's not called Ritzicha. That's an act of Hatzol. Now, we're involved in Pikuach Nefesh, and if a person is a Rodev, then his life is meaningless. He's not someone that is included in the Isser Lo Tzirtzach. I can victimize him and murder him because he is now running after the Pikuach Nefesh. So if an Uber is included in Pikuach Nefesh, that's enough to say that the Rodev is a Rodev, and that status as a Rodev might be enough to undermine the Isser of Lo Tirtzach, vis-a-vis that Rodev. But then you have to know more about the Parsha. All right, then? So let's just make a note of where we got up to here. We are now up to Tosas Kasha. Here on the bottom right column of Yutes. And if by chance, Steve, you would have a few minutes, I don't know if you're free, to give us a little bit of a far here, if you can get Chaf Aleph, whatever you have time for. In the meantime, I'll set up the next year. We're going to discuss more about Menachos and other issues.